Your grandparents were probably middle class, and your parents might have been middle class, but you're not. And it's not because you're lazy. It's not because you didn't work hard. It's not because you made bad choices. It's because there's a pattern in history that has destroyed the middle class in every major empire over the last 2,000 years. And that pattern is playing out in the United States right now. In 100 AD, Rome had a thriving middle class of property-owning farmers and tradesmen. By 400 AD, they were extinct. Only the super rich and the desperately poor remained. In the 1500s, Spain developed a merchant middle class from New World wealth. By 1650, they were gone, crushed by inflation and taxation. In the 1700s, France had a professional middle class emerge. By 1789, they were radicalized into revolution because the system had destroyed them economically. In 1918, Britain had one of the strongest middle classes in the world. By 1979, it was fractured and diminished. The Soviet Union built a middle class of educated professionals by the 1960s. By 1991, their savings were worthless. Japan had the world's strongest middle class in the 1980s. Today, their young people can't afford to start families. 6 empires, 6 middle-class extinctions, all following the same 8-stage pattern. Stage 1, prosperity and growth, where a strong middle class emerges and thrives. Stage 2, peak and complacency, where the middle class reaches maximum size. Stage 3, wage stagnation and rising debt.
Stage 4, asset inflation makes housing and education unaffordable. Stage 5, wealth polarization creates a 2-tier society. Stage 6, opportunity dies and mobility collapses.
Stage 7, political instability as faith in the system breaks. And Stage 8, either system collapse or violent revolution. The United States entered Stage 1 in 1945 and reached Stage 2 by 1970. We've been progressing through stages 3 through 6 over the last 50 years, and right now in 2025 we're firmly in stage 7. Political instability, loss of institutional legitimacy, populism on both extremes. The middle class isn't dying. It's nearly dead, and stage 8 is coming. This is the story of how middle classes actually die, why the pattern repeats across centuries and continents, and why America is following the same trajectory that destroyed the Roman middle class, the Spanish middle class, the French, the British, the Soviet, and the Japanese. The pattern never lies, and the pattern says we're 2/3 of the way through the extinction sequence. Before we trace the pattern through 6 empires, you need to understand what a middle class actually is, and why empires keep creating them and then destroying them. A middle class isn't just people with medium incomes, it's a specific social and economic structure. The middle class is the group between the wealthy elite and the working poor who own some property, have some economic security, can afford basic necessities plus some discretionary spending, and most importantly, have realistic hope that their children will do better than they did. That last part is crucial. Hope, mobility, the belief that hard work leads to advancement. When that belief dies, the middle class dies psychologically before it dies economically. Middle classes emerge during periods of economic expansion and opportunity, after wars when labor is scarce, during technological revolutions when new industries create new jobs, during imperial expansion when wealth flows into the core. Rome's middle class grew during the Republican expansion. Spain's grew from American silver. Britain's grew from the Industrial Revolution. America's grew after World War II when we were the only major economy left standing. But here's what history teaches. Every empire that creates a middle class eventually destroys it. Not intentionally, not through some conspiracy, but through a predictable sequence of policy choices that benefit the elite at the expense of the middle. And once the sequence starts, it's almost impossible to stop. The pattern is simple. First, wages stop growing even as productivity increases. The gains from economic growth go entirely to owners and the wealthy, while the workers' share shrinks. Second, to maintain living standards despite stagnant wages, the middle class goes into debt. Consumer debt, mortgages, student loans. Debt becomes the way to afford what wages no longer cover. Third, assets inflate. Housing prices, education costs, and healthcare costs all rise faster than wages. Things that used to be accessible to the middle class become privileges of the wealthy. Fourth, wealth concentrates at the top. As assets inflate and wages stagnate, the gap between the rich and the middle grows extreme. Fifth, opportunity disappears. When wealth determines outcomes more than work, mobility dies. The ladder is removed. Sixth, political power follows wealth. The wealthy use their power to rig the system further in their favor through taxes, regulations, and policies. And seventh, the middle class, seeing the system is rigged, loses faith in institutions and turns to political extremes. And eighth, either the system reforms dramatically, which almost never happens, or it collapses into either economic breakdown or revolution. 6 empires have followed this pattern, and all 6 destroyed their middle classes. Let's trace the pattern from ancient Rome to modern America and see why stage 7 always leads to stage 8. Let me lay out the 8-stage pattern explicitly before we trace it through history. Stage 1 is prosperity and growth. This is when a middle class emerges or grows strong, usually after a war, during economic expansion, or from some new source of wealth. A single income can support a family. Home ownership is common, education is accessible, savings are possible. Upward mobility is real. Life gets better each generation. This stage can last decades. It's the golden age that older generations remember and younger generations hear about but never experience. Stage 2 is peak and complacency. The middle class reaches its maximum size, often 50 to 60% of the population. Things are good. People believe the prosperity is permanent. They think the system is stable. They assume their children will have the same opportunities. This is the stage where everyone believes the good times will last forever. Nobody sees the decline coming. Stage 3 is wage stagnation and rising debt. This is where the decline begins. Productivity keeps increasing, but wages stop growing. The gains go to owners and executives. To maintain living standards, the middle class borrows. Consumer debt rises, credit cards, car loans, home equity lines. Debt shifts from being for major purchases to being for everyday expenses. Stage 4 is asset inflation. Housing prices start rising faster than incomes. What used to cost 3 times annual salary now costs 5, 6, or 7 times. Education that was cheap or free becomes expensive. Healthcare becomes unaffordable even with insurance. The things that define middle-class life, home ownership, education, healthcare, become privileges instead of normal expectations. This stage is devastating because it locks out the next generation. Your parents bought a house at 25. You can't afford one at 35. Stage 5 is wealth polarization. Assets inflate and wages stagnate, causing society to split into 2 tiers. The wealthy who own assets see their wealth grow. The middle class who depend on wages see their relative position decline. The gap becomes a chasm. A 2-tier society emerges where outcomes are determined by inheritance and connections, not work. Stage 6 is loss of opportunity and mobility. Income mobility collapses. Education no longer guarantees advancement. Hard work no longer leads to prosperity. The ladder that allowed previous generations to climb is removed. If you're born middle class, you're likely to stay middle class at best or fall into the working poor. If you're born poor, you stay poor. The American dream becomes the American lottery, possible but unlikely. This is where hope dies. Stage 7 is political instability. This is where we are now in America. When the middle class realizes the system is rigged, they lose faith in institutions. Trust in government, media, and courts all collapses. Political extremism rises on both the left and right. Populist movements gain power. Social unrest increases. The system's legitimacy is questioned. This is the danger zone. Stage 8 is collapse or revolution. Either the economic system collapses and the middle class is wiped out through inflation, depression, or breakdown. Or revolution happens, where the middle class, having lost everything else, demands violent redistribution. Sometimes it's a slow collapse over decades. Sometimes it's sudden. But once stage 7 is reached, history says stage 8 is almost inevitable. Now let's watch this pattern destroy 6 empires across 2,000 years. The Roman middle-class story begins in the Republican era and early empire. By 100 AD, Rome had a substantial middle class. These were plebeians who owned land, small farmers with maybe 10 to 50 acres, enough to support a family and sell surplus, tradesmen, shopkeepers, and lower-level officials. They owned property. They had economic security, they could vote, they served in the legions. They were citizens with rights. This was stage 1 and 2. The Roman middle class at its peak was probably 30 to 40% of the free population. Not huge by modern standards, but significant for the ancient world. Stage 3 began around 150 AD. Roman expansion slowed. The easy conquests were over, but the costs of defending the empire kept rising. Maintaining legions on distant frontiers was expensive. Wages for soldiers had to be paid. But tax revenue wasn't growing because expansion had stopped. The solution was debasement. Roman emperors started mixing base metals into silver coins. A denarius that was supposed to be pure silver became 50% silver, then 30%, then less. This is the ancient equivalent of printing money, and it had the same effect: inflation. By 200 AD, prices were rising dramatically. The middle class, who held savings in coin, saw their wealth evaporate. A lifetime of savings became worthless as currency was debased. Stage 4 was asset consolidation. The small farmers struggled with inflation and rising taxes. They had to sell land. Who bought it? The wealthy, large landowners. Lafundia bought up small farms at distressed prices. By 250 AD, land ownership was concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. The middle class of small farmers was disappearing. If you lost your land, you became a tenant farmer or moved to Rome to live on the grain dole. Stage 5 was complete wealth polarization by 300 AD. Roman society was now 2 tiers: the extremely wealthy senatorial class and the desperately poor masses. The middle was gone. Senators owned estates the size of small countries. Everyone else was poor. Stage 6 was the death of mobility. In earlier Rome, a farmer's son could become a soldier, then an officer, then a landowner, and maybe even a senator. That path closed. By 300 AD, if you were born poor, you died poor. The Roman Empire had become a rigid class society. Stage 7 was political chaos. The 3rd century crisis from 235 to 284 AD saw 50 emperors in 50 years, civil wars, and rebellions. The empire nearly collapsed. The middle class, what was left of it, had no faith in the system, and stage 8 was the slow collapse. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. The middle class never recovered. For 1,000 years after Rome fell, there was no substantial middle class in Europe. Feudalism replaced it. Lords and serfs, rich and poor, no middle. The Roman middle class extinction was so complete it took a millennium to rebuild. Spain's middle class story is shorter but equally devastating. In the early 1500s, Spain conquered the Americas and discovered the richest silver mines in history. Potosi in Bolivia, Zacatecas in Mexico. Silver poured into Spain by the ton. This created stage 1. A merchant middle class emerged. Traders, bankers, professionals. Spain became the richest nation in Europe. The middle class in Spanish cities like Seville and Madrid thrived. This was from 1500 to 1550. Stage 2 peak was from 1550 to 1580. The Spanish middle class was probably 30 to 35% of the urban population. Things were good. Spain was the superpower, but stage 3 began almost immediately. All that silver caused inflation. Prices rose dramatically as the money supply exploded. By the 1580s, inflation was severe. Wages didn't keep up. The middle class had to borrow to maintain living standards. And Spain's kings were spending the silver faster than it arrived, fighting wars across Europe and maintaining the empire. Debt piled up. Stage 4 was asset inflation. Land prices soared. Only the nobility could afford estates. The middle class was priced out. Housing in cities became expensive. What a merchant's salary could buy in 1500 was half what it could buy in 1600. Stage 5 was wealth concentration by the early 1600s. The nobility, who didn't pay taxes, accumulated wealth. The middle class, who did pay taxes and faced inflation, declined. Spain became two-tier, rich nobles and poor peasants. Stage 6 was mobility collapse. The Spanish middle class couldn't advance. The nobility was a closed caste. If you weren't born noble, you'd never be noble. And without land or title, you couldn't accumulate wealth. Stage 7 was crisis. Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times between 1550 and 1650. 4 sovereign defaults. By 1640, revolts broke out. Catalonia rebelled. Portugal regained independence. The system was breaking. Stage 8 was collapse. By 1650, the Spanish middle class was effectively extinct. The wealth from the Americas was gone, wasted on wars and luxury. Spain went from superpower to secondary power in 50 years. The middle class never recovered to its 1550 levels. Spain's story teaches that natural resource wealth can create a middle class. But if that wealth isn't managed properly, it destroys the middle class through inflation and debt even faster than it was created. France's middle class extinction culminated in revolution, which is one possible outcome of stage 8. In the early 1700s, France developed a strong professional middle class. Lawyers, doctors, merchants, minor officials. They owned property, had education, and enjoyed some prosperity. This was stage 1 and 2. By 1750, the French middle class, what they called the bourgeoisie, was maybe 15 to 20% of the population. Not huge, but influential. Stage 3 began around 1750. France was fighting expensive wars, the 7 Years' War and support for the American Revolution. The costs were enormous, but the French tax system was insane. The nobility and clergy, the first and second estates, paid almost no taxes. The third estate, which included the middle class and peasants, paid everything. So as costs rose, taxes on the middle class rose. Stage 4 was the 1770s and 1780s. Bread prices spiked. Housing in Paris became expensive. The middle class was being squeezed. They were educated, they worked hard, but they were taxed heavily and saw no return. Meanwhile, the nobility lived in luxury at Versailles. Stage 5 was extreme polarization. By 1780, French society was rigidly divided. The nobility flaunted obscene wealth. The middle class struggled despite education and effort, and the poor starved. Stage 6 was total loss of mobility. If you weren't born noble, you'd never be noble. The middle class hit a ceiling. They could be lawyers and doctors, but they'd never have real political power or social status that belonged to the nobility by birth. Stage 7 was 1788 and early 1789. The government was bankrupt. King Louis XVI called the Estates General, a parliament that hadn't met in 175 years, to legitimize new taxes. Instead, the Third Estate, led by the middle class, declared themselves the National Assembly and demanded equal representation. The middle class had lost faith in the monarchy. They didn't believe the system could be reformed. Stage 8 was revolution. On July 14, 1789, the Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution began. The middle class, radicalized by economic destruction and loss of hope, helped overthrow the entire system. Thousands were executed. France descended into the terror. The revolution eventually led to Napoleon and decades of war. The middle class didn't win. Revolution consumed them too. Many middle-class revolutionaries were themselves executed. Stage 8 in France shows that revolution doesn't save the middle class. It destroys them in a different way. Britain's middle-class extinction happened slowly over 60 years. In 1918, after World War I, Britain still had a strong middle class. Shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, lower managers. They were the backbone of British society. This was stage 2, the peak. Britain's middle class was probably 40 to 45% of the population in the 1920s, but stage 3 began almost immediately. World War I had been devastatingly expensive. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to cover the costs of maintaining the empire. Troops in India, Africa, and the Middle East were enormous. But Britain's economic dominance was fading. Wages stagnated in the 1920s and 1930s while the costs of empire remained. Stage 4 was the interwar period, especially after World War II. Housing became expensive. London property prices rose while wages didn't. The British middle class was being priced out of home ownership. Education, while better than most countries, was still tiered. Only the wealthy could afford the best schools. Stage 5 was the 1950s and 1960s. Britain lost the empire. India and Africa all gained independence. The economic benefits of empire were gone, but the British middle class saw their relative position decline. The wealth gap grew. The aristocracy remained extremely wealthy while the middle class stagnated. Stage 6 was the 1960s and especially the 1970s. British social mobility collapsed. The class system hardened. If you were born working class, you stayed working class. The middle class couldn't advance to the upper class, and working class children struggled to reach the middle class. The ladder that had existed was broken. Stage 7 was the 1970s, the winter of discontent. Strikes paralyzed the country. The lights went out, garbage piled up in the streets, inflation hit 25%. The middle class, seeing their savings destroyed by inflation and their opportunities limited by a rigid class system, lost faith. Political extremism rose. Stage 8, Britain didn't have revolution or total collapse, but the middle class never fully recovered. Margaret Thatcher's policies in the 1980s financialized the economy, but hollowed out the industrial middle class. By 2000, the British middle class was smaller than in 1950. Today, young British people face the same problems as young Americans: unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, and less opportunity than their parents. The British middle class went from 45% of the population in 1950 to maybe 30% today. It wasn't destroyed as dramatically as Rome or France, but it was significantly diminished. Stage 8 in Britain was slow decline rather than sudden collapse. The Soviet Union's middle class extinction was unique because it happened in a communist system, but the pattern was the same. By the 1960s and 1970s, the USSR had developed a middle class of sorts: engineers, doctors, teachers, and lower-level party officials. They didn't own property in the Western sense, but they had stability, decent wages relative to workers, and access to better goods. This was stage 1 and 2. The Soviet middle class might have been 20 to 25% of the population. They were educated, urban, and relatively prosperous by Soviet standards. Stage 3 began in the late 1970s and especially the 1980s. Soviet economic growth stagnated. The centrally planned economy couldn't keep up with the West. Wages didn't rise, but more importantly, the official economy stopped functioning. Necessities had to be bought on the black market. The Soviet middle class had to use connections, bribes, and black market trading just to maintain basic living standards. Stage 4 was the 1980s under Gorbachev. Even with perestroika reforms, the system was breaking. Goods were scarce. The official prices were fiction. The black market was the only real economy. The Soviet middle class's savings held in rubles and state banks were becoming worthless because there was nothing to buy. Stage 5 was the late 1980s. Soviet society became two-tier. The party elite had access to special stores and foreign goods, while everyone else was struggling. The party elite lived like the Western middle class, while the Soviet middle class lived in scarcity. Stage 6 was mobility collapse. If you weren't in the party elite, you couldn't advance. The Soviet system was supposed to be egalitarian, but it had become a rigid hierarchy. Stage 7 was from 1989 to 1991. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Republics were declaring independence, and the Communist Party was losing legitimacy. The middle class had lost all faith in the system. They had spent decades being told they were building a better future, and they saw it was a lie. Stage 8 was the collapse of 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved, and the ruble became worthless. Hyperinflation hit 2,500% in 1992. The Soviet middle class's life savings, maybe 50,000 or 100,000 rubles saved over a lifetime, became worth less than a month's groceries. They were wiped out overnight. The 1990s in Russia were catastrophic for the former middle class. Poverty exploded and life expectancy dropped. The Soviet middle class extinction was perhaps the most sudden. Decades of savings were destroyed in months. It shows that stage 8 can be a sudden collapse where the middle class is financially obliterated. Japan's middle class extinction is happening right now, and it's the most similar to America's trajectory. In the 1970s and 1980s, Japan had the strongest middle class in the world. Over 90% of Japanese identified as middle class. Lifetime employment was the norm. Housing was expensive but accessible, and education was excellent. Savings rates were high. This was stage 2, the peak. Japan seemed invincible, but stage 3 began in 1990 when the asset bubble burst. Japanese real estate and stock prices collapsed by 60 to 80%. Companies stopped offering lifetime employment, and wages stagnated. They've been stagnant for 30 years now. Japanese workers today earn essentially the same nominal wages they earned in 1990. 35 years of zero wage growth. Stage 4 is ongoing. Housing in Tokyo remains extremely expensive relative to wages. Education is still costly. Healthcare is good, but the population is aging rapidly. The Japanese middle class can't afford the lives their parents had. Stage 5 is polarization. Japan has developed a two-tier society: regular employees with some security and irregular employees, contract and part-time workers with no security, no benefits, and low pay. The irregular workers are 40% of the workforce now. They're locked out of middle-class life. They can't afford marriage or children. Stage 6 is mobility collapse. If you're born into an irregular worker family, you're likely to be an irregular worker. If you don't get into a top university, you're locked out of the best jobs. The path to success has narrowed dramatically. Stage 7 is where Japan is now. Political disillusionment is widespread. Young Japanese have given up on the system. They see no point in working hard because it won't lead to prosperity. Birth rates have collapsed to 1.3 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. Not because Japanese don't want children, but because they can't afford them. This is stage 7, loss of faith, loss of hope. And stage 8 is ahead. Japan isn't facing revolution, but they're facing demographic and economic decline. The middle class is shrinking, the population is shrinking, the economy stagnates. Stage 8 in Japan might be a slow fade rather than a crash, but middle class extinction is happening. Japan went from 90% middle class in 1980 to maybe 60% today. Now, let's trace the United States through all 8 stages in detail, because this is where we are today. Stage 1 began in 1945. World War II ended. America was the only major industrial power not destroyed by the war. We had 50% of global GDP. Jobs were plentiful. The GI Bill sent millions to college for free. Housing was cheap. A modest home cost about 2 times annual salary. You could buy a house at 25 on a single income. Healthcare was affordable. A doctor visit cost a few dollars. Major surgery was expensive but manageable. And most importantly, unions were strong. About 35% of workers were unionized. Unions negotiated wage increases that matched productivity. When companies made more money, workers got raises. This was the golden age of the American middle class. Stage 2, the peak, was from 1945 to 1970. The American middle class reached its maximum size and strength. By 1970, about 60% of Americans were middle class. You could graduate high school, get a factory job, buy a house, support a family, and retire with a pension. College was cheap or free at many state schools. You could work a summer job and pay tuition. Social mobility was real. Most people did better than their parents. Upward mobility rates were 90%. This is the era your grandparents remember, when the American dream was real and when hard work actually led to prosperity. This was the peak, and it was about to end. Stage 3 began in the 1970s and accelerated after 1980. Wages decoupled from productivity. From 1948 to 1973, productivity grew 97% and wages grew 91%. They moved together. Workers shared in economic growth. But from 1973 to 2020, productivity grew 62% while wages grew only 17%. The gap is 45 percentage points. All the productivity gains went to executives and shareholders. Workers got scraps. Why did this happen? Unions were destroyed. Union membership went from 35% in 1970 to 10% today. Without unions, workers had no bargaining power. Tax rates on the wealthy were slashed. The top marginal rate went from 70% in 1980 to 37% today. Financial deregulation allowed Wall Street to extract wealth. Globalization moved manufacturing overseas. The system was restructured to benefit capital over labor. As wages stagnated, the middle class borrowed to maintain living standards. Consumer debt exploded. Credit cards became common in the 1980s. By 2000, the average household had $8,000 in credit card debt. By 2025, it's over $17,000. Auto loans went from a $24,000 average to $40,000. The middle class was going into debt just to buy basics. This is stage 3. stagnant wages and rising debt. Stage 4 began in the 1990s and exploded after 2000, asset inflation. Housing prices started rising much faster than wages. In 1970, the median house cost 2 times the median income. By 2000, it was 4 times. By 2025, it's 7 times. Housing became twice as expensive relative to wages as it was for your grandparents. College costs exploded even more dramatically. In 1970, a year at a public university cost about $400. With inflation, that would be $3,000 today. The actual cost is $25,000, 8 times more expensive than inflation would predict. College went from something you could work your way through to something requiring massive debt. Student loan debt went from essentially zero in 1970 to $1.7 trillion today. The average borrower owes $40,000. Many owe over $100,000. Healthcare costs also exploded. In 1970, a family spent about $1,500 per year on healthcare, about 8% of income. Today, the average family pays over $20,000 just for insurance premiums, plus $5,000 to $10,000 in deductibles. That's $30,000 to $40,000, over 40% of median income. Healthcare went from affordable to potentially bankrupting. This is stage 4. The things that define middle-class life, housing, education, healthcare, became unaffordable. Your grandparents could buy all 3 on a single income. You can't afford any of them on 2 incomes. Stage 5 is wealth polarization, and it's extreme. In 1970, the top 1% owned 23% of wealth. Today, they own 32%. The top 0.1%, about 130,000 households, own more wealth than the bottom 90%, which is 117 million households. This is worse than the Gilded Age, worse than the 1920s. The gap between the wealthy and the middle class is the widest in recorded American history. The wealthy own assets that appreciate: stocks, real estate, businesses. The middle class depends on wages that stagnate. As assets inflate and wages don't, the gap becomes a chasm. Stage 6 is the death of mobility, and this is where hope dies. In 1940, 90% of children earned more than their parents. In 1980, it was 50%. Today, it's 40%. Most people now do worse than their parents. Upward mobility has collapsed. If you're born in the bottom 20% of earners, you have a 7.5% chance of reaching the top 20%. That chance is gone. Education no longer guarantees advancement. A college degree gets you an entry-level job paying $45,000 while you serve as $40,000 in debt. Hard work no longer leads to prosperity. You can work 60 hours a week and still not afford a house. The system that rewarded work is broken. This is stage 6, the death of the American dream. Stage 7 is where we are right now in 2025, political instability. Trust in Congress is 15%. Trust in the Supreme Court is collapsing. Trust in media is at all-time lows. Half the country believes elections are rigged. The other half believes January 6th was a coup. Neither side trusts institutions. The social contract is broken. Political extremism is rising on both the left and right. On the left, there is growing support for socialism, wealth redistribution, and eating the rich. On the right, there is growing support for authoritarianism, strongman leaders, and extra-legal measures. The moderate center is collapsing. Why? Because the middle class and what's left of it realizes the system is rigged, that working hard doesn't lead to prosperity, that the game is fixed, and that their children will be worse off than they are. When people lose faith that the system can be reformed, they turn to extremes. This is stage 7. This is where we are. And history says stage 7 leads to stage 8. Let's be clear about where America is right now. We're in stage 7, political instability driven by middle-class economic destruction. The statistics prove it. The median house costs $420,000. The median income is $60,000. That's 7 times income. Your grandparents needed 3.6 times income. You need double. The average rent is $2,000 per month, over half of take-home pay. Student debt is $1.7 trillion. Medical debt causes 66% of bankruptcies. The middle class, defined as households earning $50,000 to $150,000, has shrunk from 60% in 1970 to 50% today. And that 50% is barely hanging on. One medical emergency, one job loss, one major expense, and they fall out of the middle class into the working poor. The young generation, millennials and Gen Z, have essentially no middle class. They rent forever. They have massive debt. They can't afford children. Birth rates are collapsing. Not because young people don't want families, but because they can't afford them. The American middle class isn't dying slowly. It's in stage 7 of an 8-stage extinction pattern. And what's stage 8? History gives us 2 options: economic collapse or revolution. Economic collapse is what happened to Rome and the USSR. The currency becomes worthless. Savings are destroyed. The economy breaks down. The middle class is financially obliterated. This could happen if the dollar loses reserve status, if the debt becomes unpayable, or if inflation turns to hyperinflation. The structural problems in the American economy include $36 trillion in debt, $2 trillion deficits, and money printing that could lead to collapse. Revolution is what happened in France. The middle class, radicalized by economic destruction, demands violent change. We're not there yet, but the signs are appearing. Political violence is increasing. Occupy Wall Street, January 6th, protests, riots. Both the far left and far right are openly discussing the need to tear down the system. When the middle class has nothing left to lose, revolution becomes possible. And history teaches that revolution doesn't save the middle class. It destroys them in a different way. The French middle class helped start the revolution and then got consumed by it. The third option, the one history almost never shows, is reform. Dramatic policy changes that rebuild the middle class include higher wages, affordable housing, free education, universal health care, wealth redistribution through taxation, breaking up monopolies, and strengthening unions. It's possible. FDR did it in the 1930s, but it required the Great Depression to force those changes. And even then, it required World War II to fully implement them. Reform without crisis is rare. Can America reform before reaching stage 8? Maybe. But the pattern says probably not, because stage 7 is where the political system becomes so polarized and dysfunctional that reform is impossible. The wealthy block reform, the extremes prevent compromise, and the system drifts toward stage 8. Your grandparents were middle class, you're not, and it's not your fault. You're living through an 8-stage middle class extinction that has destroyed every major empire over the last 2,000 years. Rome, Spain, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, Japan. All of them created a thriving middle class and then destroyed it. Following the same pattern, wages stagnated, debt rose, assets inflated, wealth polarized, opportunity died, faith broke, instability followed, and then collapse or revolution.
The United States entered stage 1 in 1945 and reached stage 2 by 1970. We had the strongest middle class in world history, and then we systematically destroyed it. Stage 3, wage stagnation, began in the 1970s.
Stage 4, asset inflation, exploded in the 1990s and 2000s. Stage 5, wealth polarization, is worse than the Gilded Age. Stage 6, mobility collapse, killed the American dream. And stage 7, political instability, is where we are right now in 2025. You can't buy a house, not because you're lazy, but because houses cost 7 times your income instead of 3.6 times like they cost your grandparents. You're drowning in student debt, not because you made bad choices, but because college became 8 times more expensive than inflation. You can't afford healthcare, not because you don't work hard, but because healthcare costs 40% of income instead of 8%. You're worse off than your parents, not because you're not trying, but because the system was restructured to benefit the wealthy at your expense. The pattern is undeniable. 6 empires all destroyed their middle class. All followed 8 stages, all ended in collapse or revolution. And America is at stage 7. The middle class isn't dying, it's almost dead. And stage 8 is coming. Maybe it's economic collapse when the debt becomes unpayable. Maybe it's revolution when the system's legitimacy fully breaks. Maybe, just maybe, it's dramatic reform. But the pattern says stage 7 leads to stage 8, and we're running out of time. The Roman middle class took 300 years to die. The Spanish took 150 years. The French took 90 years. The British took 60 years. The Soviet took 30 years. Japan's has been dying for 35 years and counting. And the American middle class has been dying for 50 years. We're at stage 7. Your grandparents lived through stages 1 and 2. Your parents lived through stages 3 and 4. You're living through stages 5, 6, and 7. Your children will live through stage 8 unless something changes. But the pattern says nothing will change because the pattern never lies, and the pattern is clear. The American middle class is going extinct, just like Rome, just like Spain, just like France, Britain, the USSR, and Japan. The pattern is repeating. Stage 7 is complete. Stage 8 is next. If this opened your eyes to why you're struggling, why home ownership feels impossible, why hard work doesn't lead to prosperity, and why you're worse off than your parents, subscribe. Because you're not failing. The system failed you. You're living through a middle-class extinction that has happened 6 times before across 2,000 years. Understanding the pattern is the only way to see what's coming. Stage 8 is next. The question isn't if, it's when and whether you'll be.